Please note this podcast discusses real-life crimes and may include sensitive topics such as violence, abuse, and other disturbing content. We recommend listener discretion.
Hey, Brunt. It's me, Charlie. You and me go back a long way. You've always been a fair man. Got a lot of respect for you. I bet you can't believe I'm still in, can you? Fucking liberty, mate. Absolute liberty. I've never murdered anyone. I've never raped anyone. What am I in jail for? People don't believe it. They think I'm a serial killer.
I'm journalist Helen Fospero.
I'm crime reporter Martin Brunt.
And this is True Criminals.
A journey into the darkest corners of the criminal underworld with insights from decades of true crime reporting.
The stories behind the stories, plus exclusive interviews with those closely involved in notorious cases.
Re-examining crimes so shocking, they still haunt our imaginations.
Been fighting these bastards all my life. Fighting for human rights, prisoners' rights, and it's cost me nearly 50 years of my life in boxes and cages. I want to go home. I'm an artist, born again. I hate violence. I despise it. And that's all I've done for the last 10 years, sitting in my cell, a model prisoner. Polite, respectful. They still won't let me out.
The voice and words of Britain's most notorious prisoner, Michael Gordon Peterson, better known as Charles Bronson. In this double episode, a story of violence, defiance and controversy, Bronson has waged war on the system. Over 4 decades behind bars, he's taken 11 hostages, battered more than 20 guards, and left a trail of wreckage costing £500,000. Prisons fear him, inmates avoid him, and the tabloid press can't look away. In the next episode, we'll be speaking to Dr. Bob Johnson, Bronson's psychiatrist, who first examined him in the 90s and was able to build a positive relationship. And in this first episode, we'll explore Bronson's life story. How did he end up the way he is? And should the prison system shoulder some of the blame for creating Britain's most violent prisoner? Martin, you've never actually met Charles Bronson in person, but you've spent years writing to him and receiving his art and cartoons and letters. What's it like being a pen pal, I suppose, to Britain's most infamous inmate?
I'd love to have met Charles Bronson, and who's to say I won't, but the prison system has blocked me visiting him. He's quite keen to meet me. I'm certainly not intimidated by the thought of seeing him. So our relationship has really come down to, as you say, being a pen pal to Britain's most infamous inmate. What's it like? It's a bit surreal. It's always informative. But he is a source of news stories, or he certainly was to begin with when I first contacted him. I've used the relationship to generate stories, but I think it's gone beyond that, because I think now I've learned that my contact with him is a good way of highlighting his plight and certainly explaining the bizarre situation that he's still in after more than 50 years in prison. He is still, to me, prisoner A8076AG. He's 72 years old now. He's just been moved again to the prison at Long Lartin in Worcestershire. As long as you have a prisoner's number, you can follow them around the prison system, and certainly trying to keep up with Charlie's constant moves between prisons is quite difficult. He sent me letters and also voice recordings. I've sent him back paper and felt-tip pens, and he uses those for his artwork, which is part of his big thing, channeling his rage about his incarceration into his art.
One thing you said there, Martin, that made me curious. Why won't the prison system let you visit?
I don't know. I mean, whoever makes those decisions has blocked me. Charlie has sent me visitors' orders, which is how the system works. He tells them who he would like to visit. I don't know whether it's because I'm a journalist. It might be that. I'd hate to think that they're trying to protect me, because I don't think I would have any issue in those terms going to see him. But I will continue to ask him to send me a visitor's order, and I'll fill it in, and I'll have to be honest about who I am, that I am a crime journalist. Let's see what happens. Maybe if they do move him to a less restrictive regime, I will be allowed in to see him. I hope so.
You've had correspondence and do have correspondence with a number of people behind bars, which always makes me wonder how and why did this particular unlikely contact and correspondence begin? Who wrote first, Martin?
Well, I took the initiative, and that's usually how these things work. But I'm also conscious that prisoners have an awful lot of spare time on their hands, and if you can engage them with a letter, there's a reasonable chance that they might be persuaded to write back. But I first contacted Bronson in the late 90s. There was a famous crime reporter called Jimmy Nicholson, who was a good friend of mine. He worked in Fleet Street, a number of different newspapers, and he was the first of the journalists to befriend Bronson and did much, I suppose, to establish his celebrity, his notorious celebrity, if you like. He actually, Jimmy, visited Bronson and was there when he was released briefly from Wormwood Scrubs. He took a famous photograph of him, and people might recall the photograph of Bronson looking very dapper, looking like Oliver Reed, if you like, with a fedora and his trademark handlebar moustache. But I was intrigued enough to follow Jimmy's advice and get to know Charles Bronson, because I, at that point in the 90s, was a young crime reporter learning my craft, and knowing about prisons and prisoners was an important part of me growing up as a crime reporter, I suppose. And I guess within about 10 years of me contacting Charles Bronson and then others doing the same, he became quite notorious, so much so that in 2008, there was a well-received movie made about him that was simply titled Bronson. So that gives you an idea of how famous, infamous he'd become by then.
Tell me about his art, 'cause I know he sent you bits and pieces and also sent cartoons to our psychiatrist, who we're going to be interviewing in the next episode.
A lot of us have been sent lots of Bronson's art. I'm not an art critic, but they're cartoonish. He uses a very naive style, but they're very vivid and they're very detailed, and they depict some pretty grim themes of isolation, physical restraint, madness, death, and even hope. In one haunting image that he sent me, he drew himself naked, being lectured by a tiny devil, and the caption was, "God save our dreams, it's all we have left. One simple dream will bring you through all this misery." Now, dare I say it, there are shades of Leonard Cohen's poetry in those kind of words. And I do remember I had a couple of his drawings hanging in our bathroom at home at one point. And I remember going to a school teacher's evening and a teacher taking me to one side saying, "We're slightly perturbed. Your son has told us that you've got art on your walls that show a man being hanged." And I quickly had to explain the context. But I took the point and I took it down, and we don't have Charles Bronson cartoons hanging in our...
What have you done
anywhere.
with them? Have you given them to charity or something like that?
No, I've still got quite a few, but he did send me a lot once, and I was a bit concerned that I might be accused of cashing in, because they sell for hundreds of pounds, more than that, some of them. I'd once written to him and sent lots of paper to help him with his art, and within a week he'd sent me back dozens and dozens of images, some of them on two sides of a bit of paper. And I was worried that with the escalating price that they were fetching, that I would, as I said, be accused of cashing in. So I sent them to his legal team, and I hope that they managed to get them in the hands of some charity.
Well, I'm relieved to know that you haven't got a little side hustle running there, selling his art. But I mean, really is into his art, and so much so that didn't he change his name to Charles Salvador after his hero Salvador Dali at one point?
He did. He is officially Charles Salvador now, and Dali is one of his favourite artists, if not his favourite. I don't think even Bronson would claim that there's a comparison to be made between their art, except, I suppose, that they are challenging, and there is that surreal element. And they have become valuable, certainly not as valuable as Salvador Dali's.
No, unfortunately not. Otherwise, you would be having a very profitable side hustle. Do you think the art in some ways reflects the real Charlie Bronson?
I think that he believes that it does. In fact, during his last parole hearing a couple of years ago, he gave the 3 parole board members a piece of his art, saying to them very blatantly that each piece of my art is a piece of me. His art shows how he sees himself and his miserable predicament. There are lots of hanged men, violent images, and I don't know whether he's trying to depict violence against him or against other prisoners, or whether that recurring image of a hanged man is perhaps a hint at his depression, to the extent of perhaps he's going to try and kill himself, as a lot of prisoners do. As far as I know, he's never attempted that, but it's a bit difficult to try and work out exactly what those images signify. But there are, in a lot of his drawings, little birds with a human face and tiny wings, and I guess there's an obvious hint there about freedom.
And he's sent you voice notes too, hasn't he, Martin, which I'm sure we can have a listen to a bit more of in a minute, where he really does question what he's actually in jail for.
Yes, he really is an enigma. He's turned the prison into his own personal battleground, and the system has hit back at him. And he's now one of Britain's longest-serving prisoners. I think there are probably 1 or 2 who've been in prison longer than him. But it is increasingly difficult to understand why he's still in prison. As he said in one of the voice notes that he sent to me, that he's never murdered anybody, and there are people who've done far worse things than him, who've done their time and have been released. We can listen to one of those now.
I probably deserved 30-odd years of what I've had. But this last 10 years, it's a fucking liberty, mate. I've done another 10 years on top for absolutely nothing. For behaving myself. For sitting in my cell. Creating art for charities.
Sending you voice notes like that, Martin, it's really clear he trusts you.
Yeah, he does. I'm glad to think that he does, and he's perhaps learned that over the many years of our interaction. Some people might say he's manipulating me, but I don't think that's true. He tends to respond to me writing to him. It's very rare for me to get anything out of the blue. The first voice message he sent me, over 2 years ago, and it was in the run-up to his latest parole hearing. And I used it on Sky News, and when I did, he got punished for it. He told me in the next voice message that he got a 28-day phone ban. The Ministry of Justice told me that it wasn't a phone ban. They had just decided that for a month they would monitor his in-cell phone calls. And I thought, hang on, in-cell phones, that was new to me. And it led me into another story about how the prison service had introduced landline phones in prisoners' cells. And the idea was that prisoners wouldn't have to share public phones on landings where everybody else could listen in. They could have more private phone calls.
Let's rewind to the beginning. Bronson was born Michael Gordon Peterson in 1952, a Luton boy. His Aunt Eileen once said he was gentle, never a bully. What went wrong?
The family moved to Ellesmere Port in Cheshire, and by the age of 13 he was boxing in fairground booths, fighting for cash, and starting to dabble in theft. So in some ways you could say he went off in the wrong direction, and I'm not sure what the reasons for that are. But in 1972, he was 22. He held up a rural post office in Cheshire with a sawn-off shotgun. So that's a pretty big crime. He beat up a garage attendant and inflicted grievous bodily harm on another victim. So that's really where his serious criminality began. And for all we've been exploring about rehabilitation and the rights and wrongs of keeping him in prison for so long, and the fact that he hasn't at this stage now caused any trouble in prison for 10 years, We shouldn't forget that there was a period many, many years ago when he was a very, very violent man outside of prison walls, and there were victims who suffered horribly at his hands.
Yeah, we mustn't forget that, because I was reading in your book that he stole just £26.18 that day. But of course, he did inflict grievous bodily harm. And it must have been very frightening for the people that were involved. And that crime was the beginning of a career of crime, really, which would lead him to effectively being incarcerated for life.
Yes, there were a couple of brief sentences, but it was the 7-year sentence that he got after those major crimes that really set the ball rolling. Apart from a couple of brief periods of freedom, he's been in jail or a secure mental hospital such as Broadmoor ever since.
And is that because of repeated acts of violence and his behaviour inside prison?
Yes, that's what's perpetuated his continued incarceration. He's just proved, certainly in the early days, to be a very, very violent man. Attacks on prison staff or prison teachers, figures of authority as he sees them. In 1975, his 7-year sentence was extended after he attacked prison staff. From 76 to 1987, he was repeatedly moved between prisons because of violence. Prisons just didn't want him, so they shunted him around. There were attacks on fellow inmates, assault and kidnap of prison staff and officials, and a number of rooftop protests. He tried to hang himself at one point, allegedly. He was shipped to Broadmoor Psychiatric Hospital. He became a friend of the craze. At this stage, he was still largely unknown to the public. And after that, there were moves to Parkhurst Prison on the Isle of Wight, Wandsworth, Hull. There are something like 140 prisons in England and Wales, and I think by now Bronson's probably been in half of them.
That's extraordinary. And when and why did he change his name to Charles Bronson?
Well, up to 1987, he was still Mick or Mickey Peterson. He had, in that year, a brief spell of freedom, and he turned to amateur bare-knuckle boxing. And that's when he changed his name to Charles Bronson, after the rather taciturn actor, the star of those movies Death Wish and The Great Escape. The idea to change his name to Charles Bronson came from a boxing promoter who thought it would give him a glamorous, tough guy image for his amateur boxing bouts. And the name Bronson became tabloid fodder. He once sent me a video of him boxing in an unlicensed tournament, I think in the East End of London, and I've got to say it was pretty formidable. But at least it wasn't bare-knuckle boxing. The image he showed me was him fighting with boxing gloves, but I certainly wouldn't have wanted to be his opponent.
No, I'm sure you wouldn't have wanted to. You said their brief spell of freedom, and it really was brief, wasn't it?
Yeah, he was free for 69 days in 1987. And then he robbed a jewellery shop to get a ring for his girlfriend. And apart from one other brief spell of freedom in 1992, he's been in prison ever since. There were more violent outbursts, hostage-taking incidents, repeatedly extended his sentence. In 1988, he took hostages during a 5-hour rooftop protest at Broadmoor Psychiatric Hospital. In 1994, he held Deputy Prison Governor and 3 others hostage at Woodhill Prison. That was a 3-day standoff. In 1999, he held a prison art teacher, Phil Danielson, hostage for 44 hours at Hull Prison. He actually sent me, or somebody sent me, some CCTV of Bronson leading Mr. Danielson around on a rope. Now, on the face of it, if you look at those CCTV images, it looked pretty undramatic, the two of them just wandering around the jail landing. And there was no physical harm done, but he terrorised Mr. Danielson at knife point. You didn't see that on the CCTV images. So much so that Danielson quit teaching and is still traumatised to this day. Bronson got a life sentence for that, with a minimum term of only 3 years, but he's had parole bids turned down ever since because of subsequent violent episodes.
And by the 2000s, Bronson was becoming notorious and even something of a cult figure.
Well, he was, and I suppose I'm partly responsible for that because the stories that I did and showing the letters and the artwork, I wasn't the only one. He became of interest to lots of journalists. By that time, he was spending most of his time in solitary confinement, so his story did become one of largely of his predicament. But there were other sides of him that other journalists were keen to highlight. The Daily Mail called him Britain's Hannibal Lecter. A man so savage, said the Mail, that he's kept in a special cage. Now, unlike the fictional character Hannibal Lecter, Bronson has never killed anyone. But like him, he is an intelligent man with lots of time on his hands. Bronson started to cultivate his celebrity status. He cashed in to a certain degree, and I'm sure he was egged on by publishers and so forth, but he wrote books about his prison experience. He wrote the Good Prison Guide that was very funny. A fitness guide for training in confined spaces, emphasising body weight exercises, and I'm sure a lot of people found that of genuine use. Bronson's letters, his raw, often violent correspondence detailing prison life, and his mindsets, and more recently 2 collections of his art and poetry, which include rants about prisoners' rights, some of it very justified. This writing about his life inspired the 2008 biopic starring Tom Hardy, and such was his fame that the film was simply titled Bronson. If you like the show and want to listen ad-free, head over to patreon.com/True Criminals. You can now subscribe to our ad-free tier for just £4 a month and get unlimited access to our entire back catalogue, completely uninterrupted.
Or if you love the show and want to support what we do, you can become a True Criminals Insider.
For just £3 a month, becoming an insider means you're directly supporting the podcast you love. Your support helps us create even more captivating stories and dive deeper into the most gripping true crime cases. It keeps the show going and the stories alive.
So whether you want ad-free listening or to help support the show, head over to patreon.com/True Criminals and choose the option that works for you.
Thanks for listening and for all your support. We couldn't do this without you.
Step into the world of Cold War summitry with Creating History. From Kennedy and Khrushchev's nuclear brinkmanship to Nixon's high-wire act between Beijing and Moscow, and onto Reagan and Gorbachev rewriting the rules. Explore the handshakes, glares, and gambles of summits that redrew the 20th century. Stream Creating History now, wherever you get your podcasts.
Remarkably, he also attracted lovers whilst in prison.
Yes, he's not the first to do that.
No, he's not, is he?
And you wonder how any lovemaking took place. But in 2001, he married an actress, Fatima Sarah Riemann, at Wakefield Prison. They divorced 3 years later. In 2017, he married a soap actress, Paula Williamson, but she died of a drug overdose a couple of years after that. And all through this time, his first wife, Irene, who's now Irene Dunroe, who he married in 1972, before his prison years, she stayed loyal and advocates for him.
As he's got older, the violence seems to have subsided, but he still hasn't been granted parole, has he?
No, there have been a number of parole hearings. He's got one coming up this summer. But at the parole hearing in 2008, he was still deemed a danger to the public. And then from 2014 to 2023, there have been multiple other parole rejections. At that last hearing in March 2023, Bronson put on a colourful performance as ever. I watched it on a video screen. We were allowed to tune in. He was swearing, but claiming that he's changed his violent ways. He said he'd rehabilitated himself through his art and told himself in the mirror, in one funny revelation, "That's enough, pack it in." He said, "I'm anti-crime now. I do deep breathing when I'm angry." But the then Justice Secretary, Dominic Raab, successfully opposed parole. He was asked for his view, and he argued that Bronson still remained a high risk of serious harm to the public. And the panel's verdict? Well, They decided there was no evidence of remorse for the key incidents of violence, an unmanageable risk, the panel decided. It's now 10 years since his last conviction and 6 years since any kind of reprimand inside prison for being violent.
So Bronson's now spent more than 50 years in jail, but he's not been convicted of any murders or rapes. And meanwhile, countless actual murderers and rapists have done their time and been released. His first wife, who you mentioned, Irene Dunrow, told Sky News in 2023 that she feels his incarceration now is political. He's become a symbol, saying murderers walk free. He's a political prisoner. They're scared of looking weak.
Yeah, I think there's some truth to that. Certainly his solicitor told me a couple of years ago that in his view, Bronson had become a political prisoner. The solicitor said that Raab's objection to his parole and keeping him in the close supervision centres, the kind of jails within jails, was influencing public opinion about him. So in that sense, the solicitor argued he had become a political prisoner. Now, Bronson himself says, and he said this to the parole board, that he's never murdered anybody, never raped anybody, and said in a voice message to me, "What am I in jail for? People don't believe it. They think I'm a serial killer." And I talk to people about him, and there is this general assumption that Charles Bronson is a convicted killer. It's far from the truth. Now, in 2025, it's becoming more difficult to understand why a 72-year-old who's not offended for several years is still in prison. He's now assessed, apparently, to be a medium risk to staff and fellow inmates, but is still a Category A prisoner, and he's held in those close supervision centres. He was at Wood Hill Prison at the time of his last parole hearing. He's now in Long Lartin Prison, which I think was a move that was felt to be a less restrictive regime, but it's still a high-category prison. Is it inflexibility and a lack of imagination in the UK prison system that he can't work towards release? Is the system taking revenge for his troublemaking? The UK is, after all, a country that jails more people than any other in Western Europe.
I didn't realise that. But what are your personal thoughts, Martin, on whether he should be free? Do you think he'd be a danger to the public if he came out now?
I think it's very difficult to judge. When you go to a parole hearing, there are three options really for the parole board. They can either keep you in, they can release you, or they can move you to an open prison. There isn't much flexibility. The decision last time was that he should be moved to a less restrictive regime. There was no question of him being released or even moved to an open prison. And I think that's probably the right decision, but not much has happened since. He's still in a Category A prison, and there's no suggestion that he is in any way under a less restrictive regime. I think what needs to happen is, and I'm sure this is my memory of what the parole board felt, that he should be allowed to mix with more fellow prisoners just to see how he behaves. And is it true that he only gets involved in violence with authority figures, and he is of no danger to fellow inmates? And he needs to show that he can mix within the general prison population without any incidents. The trouble is, there are likely people who are going to try and provoke him. If he can resist such provocation, then that's great, and perhaps he will then be moved to an open prison. He can't just suddenly be released after 50 years of being institutionalised. He would find life very, very difficult, almost impossible, I think. So he does need that rather slow progress through less restrictive regimes within the prison service until he's released.
Do you think he thinks he's fighting the system?
Well, during that last parole hearing in 2023, he started making arguments that his human rights were being abused. He sent me an audio message in which he said, "They keep drumming it into the public that I'm a danger, but who am I a danger to? I've never been a danger to the public." Well, he was in the early 70s because he was convicted of GBH and so on, and other violent attacks on members of the public. He went on to say that he'd been fighting with the authorities all his life, He said, fighting for human rights, prisoners' rights. I've been a model prisoner for 10 years, he said, but they still won't let me out. During his 2023 parole hearing, the last one, he started making arguments that his human rights were being abused. He sent me an audio message. We can hear a bit of it now.
Every time I get near my jam roll, silly things start happening. Like they want me to kick off. Like take this last 2 months. I've been locked up 23 hours every day. I get an hour on their yard, and that's it. I don't have time for a shower. Can't do things. Just get me 1 hour a day. And that's what you get for behaving yourself. 1 hour a day out of my cell. They cut you off from society, from your family, from your friends. Now, I've always put my hand up. And I'll take it on the chin. Any punishment they throw at me, I'll take it. 10 times over. And I'll be fighting these bastards all my life. Fighting for human rights, prisoners' rights. And it's cost me nearly 50 years of my life in boxes and cages.
Martin, let's confront the elephant in the room. Has the prison system itself created the monster it claims to contain? Was his violence in prison the result of a system that seems unable or unwilling to encourage him towards rehabilitation and an eventual release?
He said enormous damage was done to his stability through what he called the magic roundabout, and that's shunting him between jails without warning. I don't think it happens quite so much now, but certainly for a large part of his time, he's been moved constantly. At one point, there were 58 transfers in 4 years. That's extraordinary. He wrote to me, "It's gradually driven me to feel more persecuted. The system seems destined to keep me isolated and on the move." Now, Bronson's no angel, of course, and we've talked about the reasons for his initial imprisonment, very violent episodes on the outside. But the system has fueled his rage. I don't think there's any doubt about that. And then there's the impact of solitary confinement. I think unless you've actually been subjected to that, it's very difficult to understand the effect that that can have. But he's had it for so many years, 23 hours a day on your own for decades. Some days he doesn't say good morning to anybody. What does that do to a man? Bronson's written about that helplessness. He said, "I'm a very fucked up guy, desperate. It's the emptiness of never knowing when I'll be moved or where to. It's the desperation of life itself, never seeing other cons, never seeing a TV, having my family drift away. It's irreversible damage." It's very difficult to read that and not be moved. Some of those sentiments, I think, are quite heartbreaking.
He's got an elderly mum too, hasn't he?
He has, and he's as close to her as anybody can be who's incarcerated. I don't think that she gets to visit him now. She's in her 90s, but he speaks very warmly of her, and certainly ahead of the last parole hearing 2 years ago, he sent me a postcard in which he said that he hopes, for the sake of his mother, who would love to see him free before she dies, he hoped that the parole board would release him. But of course it didn't.
When you talk about the 23 hours a day on your own, not saying good morning to anybody, etc., the authorities haven't been sympathetic about this, have they?
No. The parole boards have constantly denied parole. And I hope it's not because they fear that he wouldn't cope on the outside. That's no reason to keep him banged up. But the official argument is that he still poses a risk to the public. Now, I'm reasonably sympathetic to his predicament, and lots of other people are, but you have to look at it from the point of view of some of those people who have to deal with him. And somebody I know very well, criminologist and former prison governor David Wilson, says that Bronson caused the trouble and resisted attempts to encourage him out of solitary confinement because he said he didn't want a normal life inside jail. He said Bronson was creating trouble for the sake of it. Wilson said that he once visited Bronson in solitary confinement, found him naked and covered in boot polish. That's an image that's portrayed in that movie, Bronson. According to Wilson, Bronson threatened to stab him with his moustache and told him to fuck off. I'm sure that's not the first time that a prison governor's been told to fuck off. To try to dissuade Bronson from attacking staff, Wilson says he offered him books, a radio and exercise opportunities. Bronson, he said, then took hostage the librarian who delivered those books. Wilson's also dismissive of Bronson's art. He thinks it's infantile and claims that it's Bronson who chose chaos. Well, as for his art, art is very subjective, so if that's what David Wilson thinks of his art, so be it. I have a very different view.
What's your view?
That it's a fantastic insight into how he sees his position, but I think there's also some artistic merit. Other artists have said that he does exhibit some real talent, and talent that you can chart getting better and better over the many years that he's been creating this art.
It sounds in a way, Martin, like an irresistible force meeting an immovable object, with neither side here willing to back down.
Yes, I think there's a sense that it's going to be very, very difficult for the parole board to ever release him. He says he's reformed, he's willing to work towards his freedom, but he's still in a high category prison. It's a step forward, a small step forward, I think, that he has been moved to another prison since his last parole rejection. But there is this sense that he's 72 now, and even if he is moved to less restrictive regimes over the next 2 or 3 years, is it too late for him?
With the parole hearing looming and you saying that often you instigate the correspondence, will you reach out to him again and see how he's feeling and see if he's feeling optimistic about the next hearing?
Yes, I had a postcard from him recently. I've again sent him lots of paper and pens and so forth. He hasn't yet told me how he's feeling, but he does have a parole hearing coming up. He's asked, I was told recently, for it to be public so that people like me can observe it. So it sounds as though he's still determined to put forward the same arguments to show that he's a reformed character, and he'll cling to that hope that he will at some stage get some freedom.
Well, I'm sure you'll keep us posted, Martin, here on True Criminals. In our second episode on Charles Bronson, we go deeper into the psychology of prisoner A8076AG. We'll be talking to psychiatrist Dr. Bob Johnson, who's known and assessed Bronson over many years and has developed a very positive relationship with him. What does Dr. Bob think has driven the furious clash between Bronson and the penal system? Is Bronson's fate sealed? And is the situation nature or nurture? Did Bronson keep getting locked up because he was violent, or was he violent because he kept getting locked up? Join us then. Hey listeners, True Criminals is a new show and your support means everything to us. If you're enjoying the podcast, please take a moment to leave us a review. It helps us grow, reach new listeners, and keep bringing you the stories you love. This episode is brought to you by Audio Bleach Global. Our producer is Russell Barnes, with audio production by Andrew Chappell. The original score was composed by Chap Mannequin, artwork by Bleached, executive produced by Lee Mann. Follow True Criminals on Instagram at true.criminals and on YouTube at youtube.com/@true-criminals. For exclusive content and ways to support the show, visit us at patreon.com/True Criminals. For partnership opportunities, please contact us at contact@audiobleachglobal.com.